All right, so for those of you who have been coming to Alphabet since the new year, you'll know that we did kind of a reboot of how we do our topics with an overarching theme of queer AF. And I think in the first meeting in January, we did a whole like brainstorm of all the possible things that could mean. And one that came up that really resonated for me is queer Afrofuturism. So tonight, I actually want to talk about queer Afrofuturism and particularly about the wisdom that I have received from Octavia E. Butler, who is one of my very favorite writers and who I think has a lot of Dharma in her writing. So I'm going to particularly focus on the Dharma of Octavia E. Butler tonight, and also to say it's Black History Month, and I've loved the reframe that's happened this year and maybe in previous years, and I wasn't aware of it, of also celebrating Black Futures Month. I'll like have one of my props here is another favorite writer, N.K. Jemisin. It's a collection of short stories where she is asking how long until Black Futures Month. So I'd like to think that we're getting there. And I want to just start out, well, one thing is like just connecting with the practice from Lama Rod Owens that we started out with. One of the things, the reframes that Lama Rod does on this practice of the refuges is to really invite a broader sense of the Dharma. And so he uses the words wisdom text and to really invite that inquiry. What are our wisdom texts? And I think as I've been thinking about those wisdom texts, I have been really thinking of some of the writers that have had a deep impact on me, and in particular, two writers that have particularly had like have really shaped me, I think, as an adult, who I've been engaging with for most of my adult life, are Samuel R. Delaney and Octavia E. Butler, who are considered in some ways kind of the grandparents of Afrofuturism. And Samuel R. Delaney started writing in the 60s, was really the first Black science fiction writer, and definitely like the first Black science fiction writer to receive a lot of the accolades of the sci-fi world, like the Hugo and the Nebula. And then in the 70s, Octavia Butler started publishing as the first Black woman science fiction writer. And so I just want to say, as I'm just embarking on this topic, there's like been a voice in my mind, like, who are you to be talking about Afrofuturism, Black futures as a non-Black presenting person? And so I just want to like take a moment to address that question, because it came up for me. And actually I was talking with a friend earlier today, and that question came up. And it's interesting when one of your inner critical voices gets voiced by someone else, then you're like, oh, wow, okay, now I can really engage with this. So I just want to like situate myself in relationship to this topic of Afrofuturism. So just I just want to like say, who am I? Who am I to be talking about this? You know, I want to like say that my identity is as a multiracial person, and my father's Puerto Rican, my mother is of Scandinavian descent, and so, you know, my identity, I really identify as someone who's mixed. And, you know, the formative years of my life were spent in a very multiracial community in the Mission in San Francisco, where I was surrounded by people of every race. And so that is what feels like home to me. And it's one of the reasons that I love East Bay Meditation Center and feel I have come home there, is because it is a multiracial Sangha. And I just want to speak to this other piece, which is that as someone of Puerto Rican descent, I am also descended from people who were stolen from Africa and brought to the Caribbean, particularly to Puerto Rico and Cuba, as slaves. And that's part of my ancestry. And at the same time, no one in my family identifies as Black. In fact, some people in my family on the Puerto Rican side identify as white. So there can be a denial of that African heritage in the Caribbean that's certainly present in my lineage. And I was also raised to be very proud of my African ancestry. So it's just a very complicated set of factors, but I just want to address that as, you know, a very light-skinned, blue-eyed, white passing person to be just talking about Black culture. So I hope that's helpful. I offer that in the spirit. I hope it's helpful. And I think the other piece I thought after I had this conversation with a friend this afternoon, I was just like, wait a second, who is going to say that I can't speak about one of my very favorite writers, Octavia Butler, who has, you know, I've had a relationship of many decades with her writing. I've been, in some ways, my thinking has been formed through her writing in some significant ways, and she continues to have a huge influence in my life. So I also just want to speak from that point. You know, she is without question one of my wisdom texts, and so I share within that spirit. So one of the framings I want to offer as we're going into this this discussion of the wisdom and Dharma, particularly in Octavia Butler's work, is a framework from Radical Dharma. So if folks are familiar with the book by Dr. Jasmine Sadula, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, and Lama Rod Owens, they, out of that book, it's odd, it's not actually in the book, but they developed through some of the workshops they did around the book something that they call the Radical Dharma 5. And it's a set of qualities that they identify as, these are the qualities of Radical Dharma. So what they offer is that Radical Dharma includes 1, a contemplative approach, 2, embodied practice, 3, a liberatory path, 4, prophetic praxis, and 5, collective process. So, and these are qualities, you know, as I engaged with them in a workshop that Lama Rod led, I was really struck by how some of these qualities are really missing in our Western convert Buddhist practice. Sometimes we miss embodied practice. You know, we're not always on a path of liberation in the sense of collective liberation. It's very different from a sense of going towards personal liberation and the collective process. But one that really I took away from me is this piece of prophetic praxis, or I'm just going to use the word practice, prophetic practice. This question, it really, like, I had to like grapple with that question for myself. How am I engaged in a process of truth telling? How am I really engaged in my own saying what needs to be said? You know, sort of defining the prophet here as not so much someone who predicts the future, but as someone who tells the truth and tells sometimes a difficult truth. So I just wanted to add, I wanted to like offer this framework, and I'm really situating Octavia Butler's Dharma in this element of Radical Dharma, which is this, that she operates in a prophetic practice. So I'll just back up and say, like, how did I encounter Octavia Butler? I have this very distinct memory of being in the main library, the Berkeley Public Library. That's right off of Shattuck. Sometime in the late 80s, but I know I went to Berkeley High, and then lived and worked in Berkeley for a few years after high school before I went to college. And so I have this very distinct memory of being in that space a lot, and being in the science fiction section where there was a carousel of like, pocket books, right? And that on that carousel was the book Wild Seed. And I remember just like being sort of like stopping and being like, what is this book? As a teenager, I was a science fiction reader, and almost everything I read was by white men and like really misogynist, racist white men, to be real. And this was just like the first thing I'd ever seen that didn't fit into that mold. And instead it's this amazing book, that starts out in Africa about these immortals, African immortals who change gender and change shape and change into animals, and go through the Middle Passage to the United States, surviving by jumping off the slave ship and turning into a dolphin. And it just like, I had an experience as a kid and as a teenager that I read all the time. I was like a voracious reader, but I didn't see myself in what I read, I read many things where I recognized myself. And I think when I encountered Octavia Butler, it was an experience of finding my own experience in a book that I hadn't found in science fiction before. And for me, it was particularly in her depictions of gender, as like gender fluidity, these characters that moved back and forth between male and female, and also these kind of multiracial societies that she writes about over and over again. And so it was just like, I remember that moment of meeting Octavia Butler sometime in the late 80s. I can't say what year it was. And then over the years, kind of deepening. And in particular, I remember in the 90s when the Parables books came out, that it was a real, like, very revelatory and like deepened my relationship with her. And then in the summer of 2016, when it became clear to me that Trump very well may win the presidency, I had to go back and read absolutely everything that she had written. I was like, Octavia, what do you got for me right now? I need some help moving into these years. And it was very, she was, she doesn't ever soften anything for us, but it was some valuable truths that she had to share. And then I actually just went through another round over the new year of, I spent my Christmas week listening to Parables on audiobook and reorganizing my earthquake kit. Because I was like, what does Octavia have to tell me right now? She's like, bad as things are, you still need to worry about the Hayward Fault and an earthquake. So get your earthquake kit together. And then also I was listening to, someone just put the Octavia's Parables podcast in the chat. And that was another real touchstone. So it's been amazing after, engaging with her for so many years to see that now the world has really caught up and is seeing how much she has to offer, how much wisdom she has to offer us right now. And it's interesting, she said, I'm not a prophet. I'm not predicting anything. I'm just looking at how things are and extrapolating to where they'll be if we don't do something. And she's been really right on in her it's not a prediction. It's just like, she's just like, this is where it's going if we don't intervene. And that has been prophetic, as it turns out. So I think, it just in this piece, and I mentioned both her and Samuel Delaney, these two first African-American science fiction writers, they both had really sort of groundbreaking engagements with what was happening that sometimes I don't think got recognized in the larger culture, especially at the time. So Octavia was writing the two parables, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, in the 90s, engaging with the science that was happening around climate change. In many ways, these books are about, amongst many other things, they're about climate change. And there really wasn't a wave of other speculative fiction books around climate change until the next decade. And then Samuel Delaney wrote what is really the first major novel about AIDS, or the first novel about AIDS to be published by a major publisher in 1985 in his Flight from Neverion. So they were like both people who were looking directly at what was happening in our culture and doing it through this genre of science fiction or speculative fiction or fantasy that allowed them to kind of say whatever they needed to say, allowed them the full breadth of their prophetic voices. Though, they also have Flight from Neverion here. It has this white guy on the cover, even though this character in the book is clearly depicted as a kind of very attractive, round Black man. And then, of course, you couldn't put a Black man on the cover of a science fiction book in the 80s. So it wasn't until Octavia Butler that there started to be covers. Really, it was, I think, with Wild Seed that it was the first cover of a science fiction book that actually had a Black person on it. To this day, Samuel R. Delaney, his books don't have Black people on the covers. So anyway, this is just to say that they've been really prophetic. And to tie in with the Dharma, there's a few places where I really see Octavia Butler bringing in the Dharma. One is with the idea of impermanence. So her, in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, she is giving us this religion called Earthseed. And that is a religion centered around the concept of impermanence. So just to read a verse from Earthseed: all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And it is such a powerful expression of this principle of impermanence that we get in Buddhism, that, as it's said in Buddhism, this is one of the marks of existence, is that there is change, that everything will change, that everything you have, you will lose. We will all die. There is only change. And Octavia Butler takes this idea and turns it into a religion that really guides these books and guides a sense of how to survive in our world, a world that's increasingly looking like the world that we have today. Next bit of Dharma I wanted to share is this question around, I think I would actually point to wise view. So this is one of the eightfold path, one of our paths to the end of suffering is to see clearly, to have wise view, to be able to see things as they are. And that is very much a quality in Octavia Butler's work, of just looking unflinchingly at the reality of our world, at the reality of structural racism, the reality of sexism, patriarchy, capitalism, and just saying, like, this is how it is and this is where we're going. Like, I'm not making any of this up. This is how things are if you're willing to look at it. And I know my first time reading the parables books, it was like, I don't know if I can take this much truth, but she really gives it to you unflinchingly. And I found, going back now many times, to these books, I get more and more wisdom and more hope each time I read it, even though every time it can be a painful journey. One of the other things she really engages with, and again, I'm going to point to the parables books, is around really looking at this question of nonviolence. So I think she really steps into a conversation that was already very present in the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, this question of, do we succeed through nonviolence, which is kind of the Martin Luther King approach, or do we need to, succeed by any means necessary, sort of the Malcolm X approach. And Octavia Butler is like, okay, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And so she has this protagonist who's an empath. And so she's asking this question, if you can truly feel the impact of your actions or your violence, would you still do violence? Would you do harm? Would you take a person's life if you were essentially dying with that person? And it's a challenging answer that she's giving, which is like, she's sort of also asking the question, who can afford to be nonviolent? If you are in a situation where you have to defend yourself, or even sometimes take the offensive just to survive, aren't you, in some ways, that is something that you need to be able to do? You need to be able to defend yourself. You need to be able to defend your loved ones. You need to be able to defend those who can't defend themselves. So she's really engaging in it in a very nuanced and again, like clear seeing way, just saying like, when everything's been taken from you, like, be prepared for what you're going to have to do to survive. And I think it's really like, it's engaging very deeply in the question around nonviolence. So yeah, there's a lot that is like directly engaging with the concepts of Buddhism. And I've never heard anything about her particular like awareness of Buddhism, but and she's drawing from so many different sources and different religions, but there's a lot of Dharma in there. And, in terms of her wise view, she really is like, another thing she's doing is she's really asking this question. She's looking at our tendency as human beings towards what she called hierarchical behavior, which I might call like our cultures of dominance and our tendency towards dominance and our structures of dominance through racial capitalism, through patriarchy, through all the ways that we do power over. And she's really asking the question, like, can we find our way out of these structures? This is like an essential human contradiction, that we are so intelligent and then so hierarchical. And how do we reconcile those things? And how do we find a way for our intelligence to lead us out of our hierarchical behavior? And she's, I think, a little pessimistic about whether we're capable of doing that. But she's also like, look at what's happening. It's very interesting. I was just reading the paper this morning and reading an article about families at the border and at our southern border, and just like reflecting on how much this is like what Octavia Butler is describing in Parable of the Sower, of this sort of like vast migrant. It's like the migrant caravan, but on a much greater scale, with people in the US walking towards our northern border, the Canadian border, and all of the things that happened to them, like just reading the story about this family and dealing with sexual assault and theft. And it's all the things that she describes in her book. She's just saying like, look, this is, with the way our climate is changing, this will be us here in the US migrating. We're not exempt from this. This is a very Buddhist, like the Buddha says about death, like we are not exempt from death And she's saying we are not exempt from the changes that are coming just because we're the United States. These structures that we see in Latin America can be happening right here. And yeah, this unflinching look at how things are. So this has been, I feel like it keeps me oriented to how things are, which is for me essentially the Dharma. So I want to offer a question to all of you. When thinking about this idea of prophetic practice, is that something, how does that show up for you? Is there a place where you feel like you're called to truth telling in your life? And then another question would be, how do you imagine yourself into the future? Like we're talking about Afrofuturism. I'm so curious about transfuturism, queer futurism, NB futurism. How do we how do we imagine ourselves into the future? I wanted to share just a couple of other fun things. One is there's now a graphic novel out of Parable of the Sower. I think soon to come out Parable of the Talents. I didn't really get a chance to mention all of the amazing writers who are, I think of as the children of Octavia, who are writing under the broad umbrella of Afrofuturism. I wanted to just share one great resource I recently found, which is this Black woman-owned sci-fi bookshop called Sista Sci-Fi. Great resource and a great place to learn more about these amazing writers. I also love the Octavia's Brood collection edited by Adrienne Marie Brown, with activists writing stories inspired by Octavia Butler. And then I also just wanted to mention a recent new author that I've found, Nikki Drayden, who has, this book is set in, it's called Prey of the Gods. It's set in South Africa and is all of these trans, queer characters. So it's and there's many more things. It's just an incredible burst of creativity right now. And then definitely check out Octavia's Parables podcast with Adrienne Marie Brown and Toshi Regan as a way of engaging more with the Dharma of, they're definitely sharing the Dharma of Octavia Butler. And then I just want to close with some words from Octavia Butler from her Earthseed verses. I'm just gonna read her words to close us out. This is a verse called Positive Obsession. God is change, and in the end, God prevails. But meanwhile, kindness eases change, love quiets fear, and a sweet and powerful positive obsession blunts pain, diverts rage, and engages each of us in the greatest, the most intense of our chosen struggles. May all beings everywhere be free from suffering. May all beings receive the care that they need. May all beings find ease and peace.